Okay. Well, everybody, welcome to the CRC event, Committee for the Republic of Canada. My name is Matthew Ehret-Kump. I'm a full-time political activist with CRC and the Schiller Institute. This conference is very, it's a part of our daily mobilization every day against imperialism, against the empire, against the war, against the economic crisis, and everyday fight to present solutions right now. Because I'll give a very short introduction to set the tone, and then I'm going to get Dennis Speed to speak to all of us. But what you have right now in the world is a very desperate push for war. Not just regional conflicts, although they do play into that, but a desperate push for world war. And the reason for the war is something that has been unleashed specifically around the BRICS process. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa process. With different projects, different programs like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the various projects like the New Silk Road, a commitment to make fusion commercially viable for these nations and for the rest of humanity. And so the idea with the BRICS process is not another free trade agreement deal like the TPP or NAFTA, but a more perfect Westphalian system of nations, of cultures coming together for the betterment of all of humanity. That is something right now which, when the empire watches that, which is the London Wall Street Empire, specifically the Anglo-Dutch British Empire, when they see that, they freak out. Because what they see is their total defeat and annihilation in that process. And this is something, in this process, our role in Canada is very important. Because we have a chance right now to really shift our politics and our cultural outlook towards the future, which means breaking Canada from the empire, ideologically, economically, and moving towards developing itself in collaboration with other cultures, other nations, specifically Russia, India, China, South Africa, Brazil. So, because we're at a point where you have a point where both systems cannot coexist. You have to have one system go extinct. The empire is itself self-destructive, but it also is in a position to unleash global chaos and war. And what you have on the other side is the humanist system of BRICS, the humanist system of LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which is not extinct yet, but it is also not fully functioning, especially in our culture here in the Western system, where the problem isn't that you have people dying in Syria or Palestine or Iraq. The problem is you have a population that's soul dead, that watches that and says, man, what can we do? That goes to protest in thousands of numbers against budget cuts and then gets wasted in the evening at some stupid Halloween party, and that's life. So we need to ideologically shift ourselves to be morally capable to take on leadership, which means to fall in love, like Helga LaRouche said, to fall in love with the potential that humanity has right now. In getting rid of the empire, in mobilizing the BRICS process to make it bigger than even what it is now. So with that, I would like to suggest to everybody to turn off their cell phones or put it on silent, and no drinks, no food allowed because of the conditions of the premises. And
oh, s'il y a du monde qui a besoin d'une traduction, il y a des machines pour traduire en arrière. Vous pouvez demander à Jean-Philippe, so if that's necessary.
Question is that Dennis will give a presentation, following which we will have a question and answer session where people are encouraged to speak, to throw out questions, comments, discussions, which is very important. So with that, Dennis, please.
Okay. So let me see that. Sure, go ahead. You want to get through, we'll just start with the prelude. Just go with that. So what we're going to try to do today is give various of you a reason to change your lives. Mainly because they're about to be changed in a dramatic way anyway, in a way that you probably wouldn't like. if you were still able to be conscious after your probable demise and were to be able to be resurrected and asked whether or not you approved of what had just occurred to you. That's where we are. It's sort of like being on the verge of, or in, if you will, the world audience of the First World War, where you don't even know that there's about to be a world war, let alone, you know, there's sort of wars going on in Europe somewhere, in a couple of places, around matters that have no consequence whatsoever to you individually. Yet, 4 years later, not only will 20 million of you be dead, but another 50 to 70 million will also die of a disease that you didn't even know existed 6 years earlier. That is the world that you have been graciously led into by a series of failures, disguised as individual human politicians and clergymen and others. Now, on the one hand, that exists. Now, there's something else that also exists, which is there are people who have thought the idea that the human race is necessarily tragic. That there's this notion that you have that often gets taught, used to be taught a lot more, when things used to be taught. Now things are really either asserted, or they're texted, or they're emailed. They aren't any longer taught. But back in the day when people were concerned to miseducate people, there was a notion of a cyclical theory of history. And in the cyclical theory of history, the idea was that every society rises and falls, and it's inevitable that societies have a birth, they have a maturation, and then they have a decline and then a death. And so societies are sort of like species, and certain species come into the ascendancy, and then they're superseded by others, and you really can't do anything about that. One of the authors that pushed that in a big way was a guy by the name of Oswald Spengler. And he wrote a book called The Decline of the West, which back 50 years ago, 60 years ago, you used to see on the back of all the Sunday magazines. Back in the old days, before there was Parade magazine and all these other things, where people can't read any longer, they used to have on the back of your Sunday magazine a thing called the Book of the Month Club. What this was these were suggestions being made to you for how to brainwash yourself along the lines of various forms of social policy that were being inculcated into the society. But back then, it was a do-it-yourself sort of thing in the sense that you had to actually do a little work. You had to know how to read, and you had to be able to be at least willing to become conversant in a set of opinions that were actually leading to policies that had already been pre-planned. But you were now going to think you were initiating by your having read something and independently come to the conclusion that you disagreed or agreed with that particular set of ideas. So 50 years ago, you would see on the back of the Book of the Month Club selections, Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. And if you happen to be unlucky enough, as I was back in that time, to believe the things that you were told to read, then you got his book, and you read his book. And you became very upset because you were being told that there was no choice. It was simply going to be the case that Western civilization, of which you were in some fashion connected, was definitely just going to disappear. Just going to happen, and it was going to happen in some dramatically obscene way over which you had no control. There are people in the world that plan these things, or design these things, or think in these terms, and sometimes you can't exactly blame them, because you have to understand that if you think of yourself as a species, as an animal species, then it is true that your history, your culture, your outlook is limited, and it is coming to an end, and it is ignominious, and it is obscene. This is an individual who sometimes confuses some people. His name is Bertrand Russell, lived for about a century, died in the late 60s. and is often referred to as a great intellectual. He's known for writing a very abstruse book of mathematics called Principia Mathematica, with a man by the name of Alfred North Whitehead. But he's also mainly known for over the past half century as a sort of precursor of the peace movement, and in one sense the environmentalist movement and many other things. What I'm going to do at the beginning of our presentation is I'm going to show you a set of pictures of ghosts. Ghosts that haunt you. See, people like to have parties on Halloween, but they never consider that they truly are haunted. And that their every day, their every waking minute is actually shaped by ghosts. The shadows of forgotten ancestors, good and evil. And if they were to know who those people were, they might actually begin to comprehend why they feel so bad about living at all. And I take this up because across the world, so to speak, in China, in India, also in Russia to some degree, and in some other countries, in Argentina also, people don't feel this way. People in those countries increasingly believe they have a sense of an optimism about the future. But in Europe and in North America, no future societies. Societies where young people, particularly young women, for example, there have been various specials. You can look at CNN and these other things. You know, you have these 20-year-old young women who basically are sort of hawking themselves in various ways on the internet to be subsidized by 40 and 50-year-old guys because they basically don't want to be with any 20-year-old guys because they have no money and they have no future, just like the young women have no future. So their basic thing is, let me hook up with this guy. I'll try to more or less, you know, tease out of him a certain amount of money and so on. Or maybe he's just completely lonely and he'll subsidize me. There are 1 million people, 1 million students in North America signed up and involved in various websites doing exactly what I just told you. Yeah, 1 million. So now that's a society which has condemned not only a generation or two, but itself to a kind of ignominious end. What T.S. Eliot once said, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. You just go crawling off crying in a hole in a corner. And that's how you die. But that's not the way that China thinks of itself. It's not the way that Narendra Modi thinks of his people. And I don't think it's the way that we should think about the West. So what we're going to do quickly here is just show you a set of characters who are going to figure in what I'm going to be telling you. And so we'll just run through this quickly sort of as a prelude. And because I'm not really good at, I don't like to go back and forth with visuals and audio stuff and so on. I find that to be too free associative rock music like. I want to basically show you these people, and then I want you to recognize that they're here in the room haunting it as I speak. And then that'll be the easier way for us to go through today's narrative. So that's Bertrand Russell. That's Julian Huxley. He's the brother of famous writer Aldous Huxley. He was the first head of UNESCO, United Nations Education, Social, and Cultural Organization. Let me just give you a couple of quotes from these people, because I just want to have a sense, give you a sense of something that we're going to be discussing. Some of you know that on October 2nd, the London Daily Mail ran a story claiming that a set of researchers had established that the HIV set of retroviruses actually originated in Congo in the 1920s, and that nobody noticed because nobody cared to notice until sometime after basically the late 60s, and then into the period of the early 80s when it was finally diagnosed. And therefore, people like the economist Jeffrey Sachs down at Columbia University said last Tuesday night at a forum that we attended that millions of people had died in Africa and people just didn't know because they didn't care. And they had died of that disease. And he was making the analogy to Ebola and what was going on now in West Africa, around which he had been trying to raise money for months. For 10 months, he was trying to raise money to address that situation, and nobody would give him any money. And he was shocked because he's a very good fundraiser. And his conclusion was that people just didn't care. Now, for a moment, going back to Bertrand Russell, he had, back in the 1923, wrote something called The Prospects for Industrial Civilization. And I want to here do some quoting of people, not to be boring and not to sort of even prejudice the situation. I just want you to hear some people speak in their own words about a few things. He said in 1923, "The white population of the world will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will be longer and the Negroes still longer before their birth rates fall sufficiently to make their numbers stable without help of war and pestilence. Until that happens, the benefits aimed at by socialism can only be partially realized, and the less prolific races will have to defend themselves against the more prolific by methods which are disgusting, even if they are necessary." Now I come to, that was 1923. Now this is Julian Huxley. This is a quote from him. This is, you can get this online. London Spectator, November 1924. It's an article he wrote. He says, "Not until you have lived in the southern states," he's British, "not until you have lived in the southern states, or at least lived somewhere in contact with Western veneered Negroes, can you realize at all adequately what the Negro problem means to America. Even when you stop only a few minutes in some little country town where the blacks outnumber the whites, you are apt to experience a queer feeling of insecurity, of familiar worlds upset. There is an almost instinctive reaction, a reaction to the obvious, visible differences between black and white." He goes on. This is all quotes. Okay? You have only to go to a nigger camp meeting to see the African mind in operation. The shrieks, this dancing and yelling and sweating, the surrender to the most violent emotion, the ecstatic blending of the soul of the Congo with the practice of the Salvation Army. Goes on a little bit more. Although the matter is not wholly settled, most biological authorities, such as Davenport, I'll tell you who that is in a minute, believe that which we should a priori expect is actually true. Namely, that Mendelian recombination of the two sets of factors which cooperatively build up the well-adapted Negro and Caucasian types gives rise to all sorts of disharmonious organisms. To translate for you, that means sex between blacks and whites creates mongrels. Okay? Then there is the undoubted fact that by putting some of the white man's minds into the mulatto, you not only make him more capable and more ambitious, there are no well-authenticated cases of pure blacks rising to any eminence, but you increase his discontent and create an obvious injustice if you continue to treat him like any full-blooded African. The American Negro is making trouble because of the American white blood that is in him. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now that's his brother, Aldous Huxley. Now a lot of people like Aldous Huxley, see, because Aldous Huxley liked psychedelics. And he became sort of famous in the 1960s because of his writing in the 1950s of The Doors of Perception. Then he became famous by the 60s. The Doors of Perception is the essay on psychedelics, LSD, that was the inspiration for the famous rock group The Doors. And so people look upon Huxley favorably. I don't. He gave an interview in 1958, and I want to refer to that. He gave the interview to an interviewer by the name of Mike Wallace, now deceased, used to be very famous back on CBS. Here's what he said. He said, "Aldous Huxley is a man of letters as disturbing as he is distinguished. Born in England, now a resident of California, Mr. Huxley just finished a series of essays called Enemies of Freedom, in which he outlines and defines some of the threats to our freedom in the United States. So Mr. Huxley, right off the bat, let me ask you, who and what are the enemies of freedom here in the United States?" So Huxley now responds. He says, "I should say that there are two main impersonal forces First of all, the first of them is not exceedingly important in the United States at the present time, though it is very important in other countries. This is the force which in general can be called overpopulation, the mounting pressure of populations pressing upon existing resources. And then he says, this is an extraordinary thing. Something is happening which has never happened before in the world's history. I mean, let's just take a simple fact that between the time of the birth of Christ and the landing of the Mayflower, 1620, so it's 1620 years, the population of the earth doubled. It rose from 250 million to probably 500 million. Today, it would be 1958, the population of the earth is rising at such a rate that it will double in half a century. And then he says that totalitarianism will be the result of this. So now, what happens is that the interviewer is questioning him and asking him about this. And he says, well, ironically then, one of the greatest forces against communism in the world, the Catholic Church, according to your thesis, Mr. Huxley, would seem to be pushing us directly into the hands of the communists because they are against birth control. In other words, the Catholic Church is against birth control. Huxley is saying because of overpopulation, you're going to have totalitarian governments. Therefore, we must oppose population growth because if we don't, we're going to get communism. So he's talking to an American audience who's got to say something that they're likely to believe. So the interviewer is saying, wait a minute, and that would be to say that the Catholic Church really is supporting communism, which doesn't make sense to me. And so Huxley says, well, I think that this strange paradox probably is true. Now this is important if you look at the present Pope. And if you want to actually understand one of the major forces presently going, one of the major battles going on presently in the world, which is that the Catholic Church, on the part of certain individuals who will now appear on my screen, had been targeted from the period of the late 50s and early 60s as the major opponent force to be neutralized in order to allow for radical population reduction policy to become universalized policy. Now, it's interesting to think about this thing in the Congo, therefore, from that standpoint. Because HIV is not something that you can't notice, you know. I mean, it's not like if a lot of people are dying of something like that, that people wouldn't actually know that that was going on if they were part of a colonial regime in Congo. I mean, you would see the people dying. So, the idea that it didn't become known until 1960, which is what the article says, I'll cite that in a moment so you just know. I like to document things so people don't have a sense that I'm trying to exaggerate for my point. You may not agree with my point, but you will never be able to prove or demonstrate that I didn't tell you why I said what I said. You may not like the conclusion I draw, but the conclusion will be based on what people are saying about these things. So the Catholic Church has always been a big force. I'd like to go to the next picture now. This character you probably don't know, and he's one of the most important people to your life. His name is George Bundy. George Bundy was the National Security Advisor to President John Kennedy. And one of the major architects of the Vietnam War. If you go online, you can look him up. There's been a book written about him recently. I don't think I have it here. I'll just reference it. You can take a look at it yourself. And the book describes how George Bundy, after he died in 1996, he was born in 1916, died in 1996. And the 1919 he was born, excuse me. And the book basically describes that George Bundy had he thought of his policy toward the Vietnam War as being wrong, but he never really thought about the population consequences of it. Matter of fact, he at one point proposed during the war that the United States should commit a very large number of ground troops there. He said, because it's better for us to lose the war by fighting the war with ground troops than to lose the war without fighting it with ground troops. Now, you try to figure that out. I mean, I'm still, that's Rumsfeldian to me, if you know what I mean, right? The unknown knowns and the knowns unknowns. Remember that Donald Rumsfeld back in the day of the 20 years ago with the war, they asked him about the Iraq war. That kind of logic insane logic coming from these people. Now, why he's important, though, is that I want to cite something about what he did after he worked for Kennedy. He became the head of the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation is like one of these, well, there's a Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, Carnegie Mellon Foundation. And foundations are the way in which government policy is run through non-governmental organizations. It's the way in which you also recruit people who are not part of a government structure into the extended policy implementation of a government. And you finance them so that they do what you want them to do. So I just want to cite something here. In 1964, Bundy was still in government. Kennedy had been assassinated, Johnson came in, and Bundy headed something called the 303 Committee. This was the committee that handled all covert action deployments of American intelligence. This doesn't just mean foreign intelligence, it meant anything going on in the United States. He transferred to the Ford Foundation a year later, and what he did was he carried out the same intelligence operations he was carrying out, the famous one being the My Lai massacre, Operation Phoenix operation. So that I don't go too fast and people know what I'm talking about, some people who go back that far would know that during the Vietnam War, at one point, there was an exposure of an assassination of a whole village that was done, My Lai massacre. And that exposure happened in 1969-7, but what it was part of was a program called Operation Phoenix. And the notion here was once described by an American general as, we had to destroy the village in order to save it, which is an actual quote. Look online. That was their notion of the way in which they would create, if you will, democracy or freedom in various societies in various parts of the globe. That is what you just saw in Afghanistan. That is what you have seen in Iraq. That is what is about to happen in Syria. That is what will happen any place where the present set of policies is continued and extended. Because it is policy which acts. It is the ghost of policy. It is not individuals. In the case of the United States foreign policy, and I'll come back to saying why I say that in a minute. But I'm citing these various quotes to you about depopulation and so on for a reason. I will here go to, let's go past me, George Bundy for a minute. Henry Kissinger. Okay, everybody knew as soon as that face came up, that had it, shall we say, there was a cathexis from part of the audience. Okay? So, of course, he's the one that everybody knows because of his association with Nixon. Johnson, yeah, but people have sort of an ambivalent view of Johnson. When Nixon comes in, it's obvious that you've got pure evil operating out of the American White House, and Henry Kissinger was sort of the face of that. He's supposed to poster boy for that. What he wrote, or he supervised the writing of a report in 1974. You can look at this online. National Security Study Memorandum 200. Implications of worldwide population growth for U.S. foreign and overseas interests. The whole manuscript's there. You can just take a look at it. It designates 15 nations where, because of their population growth, natural resources otherwise available to the United States would not be available. And therefore, it doesn't make recommendations about population reduction. It simply indicates that this radical population growth in Bangladesh is one of those countries, Nigeria is one of those countries, Mexico is one of those countries. There are 15 of them all listed all together. That this means that the United States has to consider from its national security standpoint how to respond to this situation. All right, so in that regard, I'll just say that there's a book which is very hard to get. For those of you who are interested, you might want to pick it up. You can probably find it online. It's called American Democracy and the Vatican, Population Growth and National Security. It's written by a man, I don't remember, his first name is Stephen Mumford. His last name is Mumford, M-U-M-F-O-R-D. And I cite this because of it having been written in tandem with Henry Kissinger's policies. as described in this National Security Study Memorandum 200. I shall also say the co-supervisor of that project was then CIA Director George Herbert Walker Bush, or Bush 41, who was the first president of the CIA, to become rather head of the CIA, to become president of the United States. And when people talk about Putin and his KGB credentials and how he's head of state, let's remember there's already been a president in the United States much earlier than Putin. So that's Kissinger, and for our purposes, that's all I'll say about it. And then let's see, I think I have a couple more here. We go to the next one. Okay, now, this is Patrice Lumumba. Many people don't know who Patrice Lumumba was. He was the first president of the Free Congo State. He was the head of the Congolese National Liberation Movement. And the reason that the year 1960 is cited as the year in the, well, I actually should just go for a moment to this little report from the London Daily Mail. Just so you know what I'm referring to here. Let's see, HIV, okay. So if you go online, and you go to dailymail.uk, or mail online, you just put it in. HIV pandemic was caused by a perfect storm of factors in 1920s Kinshasa, scientists reveal. And then it gives a series of headlines. It says, Oxford University and Belgian scientists studied virus's genetic history. They claim it originated in Kinshasa. The city was well connected with modern railways under Belgian colonial rule. By the 1950s, when first known cases were recorded, it spread to 3 more cities. And it was only discovered in 1983. Now, what they say about this, just to get it, pretty nasty actually, thing as a whole. Yeah, I got some pretty nasty stuff. Let's go at it. And by the way, if I'm making you uncomfortable, I hope I am. Because the idea here is that the ghosts that you, shall we say, facetiously act in facetious terror of are different than the ghosts that you should know. Because the Nosferatu-like creatures that are walking through the room here and on the street and in the halls of government and in the banks that treat you and care for you in your human zoo should be known to you. Now, okay, so it says here. They're talking about Kinshasa. Thriving trade hub, modern railways, which allowed the virus to travel thousands of miles. Combined with urban growth, migrant workers, and changes to sexual habits and the sex trade, this formed a perfect storm, which allowed the virus to spread unnoticed until it was too late to stop it. Okay, talks about HIV-1 group M, which is the particular strain of the virus which proved devastating, that affects 35 million people around the world today. It says this: it stayed in the Congo, which is the size of all Western Europe combined, until spreading to the United States and around the world from the 1960s onwards, before the number of cases exploded in the 1980s. Now, we're just going to take a moment. Patrice Lumumba. You probably never heard of it. Let's just hear some of his words and hear what it was that he wanted to do and what he, in fact, was able to do. It's from a speech he gave in late 1950s. We want to secure our independence through the united effort of all. We want the Belgians to put a stop to their divisive policy. We must understand each other, and they must join forces with us. This is how we can build a Congolese nation, through the friendship of all. I am in fact convinced and optimistic enough to believe that despite everything, despite the insults, the moves to intimidate us, the threats that have been made, we have chosen the path we will follow, and the sort of struggle we will wage, one that will continue to be nonviolent. I believe that this will triumph. We too decry violence. We have chosen just one weapon for our struggle, and that weapon is nonviolence, because we believe that whatever the goal, it can be reached by peaceful means. That is what our struggle represents, and that is why I call for the moral support of every friend of humanity, of all those who believe that every human being, whatever the color of his skin, whatever his social status, can and must enjoy the same freedoms as every other citizen of humanity. He was assassinated in January of 1961, 2 days before President John F. Kennedy came to office. It was well known that Kennedy, who may have had various problems on certain things, understood two facts. One, that the war in Southeast Asia, or shall we say the French War in Southeast Asia of the 1950s, which had particularly led to the defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French military by the Vietnamese, and General Giap, as well as Ho Chi Minh. But General Giap was the person responsible for that. This meant that the policy that the French had carried out was wrong, and Kennedy was opposed to those policies being entered into by the United States. Interesting to know, we'll come to that in a moment. The second thing was that he was a supporter of Lumumba and wanted Lumumba's Congo to be supported by the United States. Well, Lumumba was assassinated, and then a series of civil wars began involving first a character by the name of Shambe, and then eventually Mobutu Seki Seko, who stayed there until 1997. Mobutu was in power for about 30 years. And then you had the war with Laurent Kabila, which was supported by a lot of people because of their opposition to Mobutu, but actually, Kabila was being supported by Barrett Gold. Barrett Gold, which was a Canadian-American enterprise involving George Bush on this side and the car, the Prime Minister, I'm forgetting his name right now, with Mulroney, Brian Mulroney, right? And those guys had put together airstrips and all sorts of equipment and mercenaries. And what they did was they deployed the Ugandan, Rwandan armies as additional forces for Kabila, which was actually what was being prepared by what was called the Rwandan genocide. This is a longer story, and we can get into it in questions and answers, but the reason I'm giving you these things first is we got to go through the ghosts. Some people know, those who are still at least nominally Catholic may remember that today is All Souls Day. That there are 3 days, right? There's the Eve of All Saints. That's the one that everybody, tends to now celebrate. Then there's All Saints Day, that was yesterday, November 1st. And then there's All Souls Day. And if you happen to know the work by Dante Alighieri, the Commedia, the Divine Comedy, which takes place not at that time, it actually takes place over Good Friday, Saturday, and Easter Sunday. But there's an analogy because Dante, in his poem, walks through hell, he walks through heaven and purgatory. And All Souls Day, what All Souls Day is about is that all those people that didn't make it in heaven and who've been in various ways forced to do penance in purgatory. They're being purged of their sins. And there's various kinds of tortures and so on that they go through in purgatory. That they can be released from purgatory through prayer that's offered by the living to certain individuals, saints, etc. For example, the Virgin Mary and others. And on this day, what happens is you can get out of jail. You can get out of jail when somebody who's living decides to really work hard enough to get you out. And this references the action of Christ after his death on the cross on Good Friday, when it said that Christ descended into hell and he released from Satan certain of the condemned. So I'm going through this because today is a certain day which is of relevance to certain of the souls that have been kept in purgatory. The purgatory of political inaction that you and I have participated in contemporary North America, that keeps all of these people from even being known, and they'll never again be known unless we resurrect them. Let's go to the next picture, please. Yes, I did. Did I send you De Gaulle? I mean, Malcolm? Malcolm X?
Yes.
Yeah, let's go to him. That's what I want. I want Malcolm up there. Now this is significant. I was having a conversation with Matthew, and he didn't know something that's important for me to point out, because maybe other people don't know it. And there is, again, we're setting up a conception here for you to understand. Because if we don't set the conception up, there's no way for at least me to make sense to you about why I think you should change everything you're doing and do what we do, those of us who've been doing it. Malcolm X was born in 1926, I believe, and was killed in February of 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, just on 165th Street, Broadway. Now, Malcolm, in the year before he died, many people apparently know about something called the journey of self-discovery when he went to Mecca. But what they don't know is that what he was doing in Mecca and what he did after that, immediately after that, was he was organizing what he called the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Now, there was the Organization of African Unity, which had come into being in the aftermath of the independence struggles, which Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Patrice Lumumba of Congo and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and various other people, and for that matter, Nasser of Egypt. All these people were organizing independence struggles of various types. Some were nonviolent, some were not. So they had organized at the United Nations. What had been noticed was that Africans were now at the United Nations, and they were coming from states that had achieved freedom. And Malcolm and people like that who were up in Harlem, Malcolm at that time was with the Nation of Islam, noticed that these Africans got more respect than Black Americans got, because frankly they weren't considered to be as both backward or inferior as Black Americans were. And so what Malcolm thought he needed to do, particularly as he was disengaging from the Nation of Islam, was to form what he called the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Now, the thing to understand is that this was an active thing going on all through 1964. And he went to many different countries in Africa, meeting with heads of state. And he also did this also in Paris. He went to London and several other areas where African expatriates were. And his conception was that what he was going to do was to create an international movement that was then going to use the presence of Black Americans in America, particularly in New York City, to agitate for what he called human rights, not civil rights. He was counterposing himself in one sense to King, but there was a reason he was doing it. This is what he was saying. Malcolm argued that what King and others were doing was redundant. Why? He said, because you're arguing for rights that other people that are in the United States just have, that are in the Constitution. In other words, you have to go march to be given the right to eat a bad hot dog at Woolworths. Okay? You have to march for that. You have to march for the right to sit in the front of a bus next to somebody you don't like. You're required to march to get the right to vote. But you got the right to vote back in 1868. Black people were voting back then. So why do you have to do all these things for rights that other people have that are in the Constitution if you're actually equal? You must not be equal. That must be why you're doing it. Now, on the other hand, if you were saying to me that you were campaigning for human rights, and there was a movement for that, and we had some kind of analogy or a system of connection, then I could organize for that. Now, so that was now, when you see this thing, a man who stands for nothing will fall for anything. Important. Important for you guys. Important for everybody. Important for me. If you don't stand for anything, you will fall for anything. That's how it works. There is no such thing as freedom bequeathed to anybody. Anybody who tells you you're born free, is a liar. There is no such thing. Nobody here was born free. Because if you do not come up with a way of being able to understand how the processes of mentation, of creativity, work in your mind, then you don't know what the limitations are on what you know. So how can you be free? You don't even know how you're limited in your thinking. It's like Americans that believe that the Bible was written in English. I mean, how do you begin to talk to somebody like that? God spoke English, and He wrote the Bible. You know, there is no way to communicate an idea to someone who's starting from that premise. Not through that doorway. You may be able to communicate with them by having them do car repair or something like that. If you work on repairing an automobile, then you can get an idea across. Because, you know, there are certain things that have to be done to make the car work. And therefore, you can communicate an idea in that fashion. But if you're going to discuss, by the way, these are the same people discussing the evil of the Quran, which they have never read. Not to mention that they would be reading it in English, if they could read English. So let me just sort of step back for a minute to just give an idea. Okay, so that's not, let's go to the next, because this one, about Robert Kennedy, is he there? That's good. Progress is a nice word, but change is its motivator, and change has its enemies. I want to stop here with the Kennedys, and now we're ready, so to speak. Now we can do the presentation and discuss what we came here to discuss. You know, Vladimir Putin has been saying some things that people don't like. And the things that Vladimir Putin is saying, I've been talking about in the last week, are really most reminiscent of the kind of things that Bobby Kennedy used to say and JFK used to say. But you can't hear them from an American president today because there hasn't been an American president, actually, of any type since Bill Clinton, of any type. And there hasn't been a real American president since JFK. There simply hasn't been anybody in the White House since November 22nd, 1963, that has been free and capable of utilizing the powers of the American presidency, except for a couple of occasions, which I'll reference as exceptions. Those exceptions have been important, but the actual presiding over the American presidency ended in November of 1963. Here is why I cite the Kennedys in particular, and Bobby Kennedy. He was killed in June of 1968. He was killed 2 months after Martin Luther King was killed, on April 4th of 1968. And his brother had been killed just under 5 years earlier than that. So to understand the United States and the present-day United States, it's impossible to get at it unless you understand the ghost of the Kennedy brothers. Because it's that ghost of what they did and what they were prevented from doing, which is the proper referent that, for example, people like Vladimir Putin are taking when they talk about today's United States. Here I want to cite to you something that Putin has said. This is only a few days ago. This was in a place called Valdai. It was actually on last Saturday, on October 25th. And I want you to hear what he's saying, because it may cause you some concern, hopefully. This is what he has to say about the United States and about foreign policy. This is last Saturday. Let's ask ourselves how comfortable we are, how safe we are, how happy we are living in this world, and how fair and rational has it become. Maybe we have no real reasons to worry, to argue and ask awkward questions. Maybe the United States' exceptional position and the way they are carrying out their leadership really is a blessing for us all. And their meddling in events all around the world is bringing peace, prosperity, progress, growth, and democracy. And we should maybe just relax and enjoy it all. Let me say that this is not the case. Absolutely not the case. A unilateral diktat in imposing one's own models produces the opposite result. Instead of settling conflicts, it leads to their escalation. Instead of sovereign and stable states, we see the growing spread of chaos. And instead of democracy, there is support for a very dubious public, ranging from open neo-fascists to Islamic radicals. Why do they support such people? They do this because they decide to use them as instruments along the way in achieving their goals, but then burn their fingers and recoil. I never cease to be amazed by the way that our partners just keep stepping on the same rake, as we say here in Russia. That is to say, they make the same mistake over and over. They once sponsored Islamic extremist movements to fight the Soviet Union. Talking about 1979, 80, 81. The fiercely independent Afghan freedom fighters, for those of you who never heard that phrase. Otherwise, you look at the Rambo 5, is that the one where he goes to Afghanistan? Yeah, look at the Rambo, find Sylvester Stallone, he'll tell you all about it, he'll give you the picture. For those that don't like reading. Sylvester Stallone is the only actor I know that has a stuntman just to perform his lines. They openly sponsored Islamic extremist movements to fight the Soviet Union. Those groups got their battle experience in Afghanistan and later gave birth to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The West, if not supported, at least closed its eyes and, I would say, gave information, political and financial support to international terrorists' invasion of Russia. We have not forgotten this. And the Central Asian region's countries. Only after horrific terrorist attacks were committed on U.S. soil itself did the United States wake up to the common threat of terrorism. Let me remind you that we were the first country to support the American people back then, the first to react as friends and partners to the terrible tragedy of September 11th. And the specific incident he's talking about is within the first hour and a half of the planes hitting the Trade Center, Putin called Bush and told Bush, we are having our nuclear rocket forces stand down. Now let me explain to you why he made that phone call. Because under normal circumstances, if something like that happened in the United States, it is the responsibility of the nuclear rocket forces of Russia to blow up the United States. Huh? Yeah, I understand that. If something like that happens, that constitutes either, because the Russians knew they hadn't done it. So the question is, well, who else has the capability to do this? They recognized immediately that only a multi-tasked government force could have carried out what occurred on 9/11 on American soil. There is zero possibility that either a combination of governments or the United States government itself or sections of the United States government would have had to have carried that out. And since Putin was head of KGB particularly, he particularly knows this. So their responsibility under normal circumstances is just to wipe you out, so to speak. That's what they're supposed to do. I have an associate, and we'll call him Victor. And Victor came to a conference we did in March of last year. And he's from Russia. And Victor has been in the United States for 35 years. And Victor said he came to the conference to deliver a message to the conference. He was not an official speaker at the conference. He would not be an official speaker. But he explained to me that his contacts don't operate at the level of the KGB. They're at a level beyond that. And that for 30 years he had had a task, one task, and that was to continually brief different generations of intelligence officers from the United States and from England and from Israel and other places on one simple reality. that the military policy of Russia, under circumstances of anybody attempting to provoke any form of conflict on the border of Russia, is full launch of all thermonuclear weapons instantly. Now he explains further, Victor does, and he said this in his statement, that he knows, and they know, that means that the United States will retaliate immediately. And he said, and we further know that what that means is that you're going to have a cloud of radioactive dust, cesium cloud, rise 150 miles off the surface of the Earth. And it will surround the Earth, and it will stay there. And everything on the Earth, with the exception of certain plankton and other things, underneath the Antarctic, will be obliterated. He said, now my problem is that I have noticed that over the past 30 years, the people that I brief are less and less intelligent. He said, whether the Israeli intelligence, British intelligence, whoever it is. So I want to come to your conference because I'm aware of what you did in 1983. What he means is that Lyndon LaRouche, of the LaRouche Political Action Meeting and so on, negotiated with the Russians for 3 years on a policy on behalf of the Reagan administration. And Vladimir knows this, and other people know this, and this is sort of, it never gets admitted by the American government, but it's a well-known fact to people who need to know. And so the concern is that you have radical or rampant insanity, essentially, particularly in the White House. Particularly a person like Obama, and that's another issue, but in one sense it has to be brought up here, because that's a true problem. I don't know if there are many people here who go back to or would even have a chance of having seen something called Mad Magazine, but as a character, Alfred E. Newman was sort of the emblem, the metaphor. And the reason for this magazine was the magazine was created because of mutual and assured destruction. That's why it was called Mad Magazine. And the character, Alfred E. Newman, always wears this button. And he's basically a dork. He's basically an idiot. The face is the face of an idiot. And the button always says, what? Me worried? And that is the face of lunacy that we presently have staring at us in various forms out of the windows of the Oval Office. You may not like that, but you better know it. And that's what the problem is that a lot of people are having that are doing briefings, that are trying to get through to Washington, is that what's coming back to them is something that they keep trying to figure out. Whereas certain of us are trying to say to them, never underestimate the factor of insanity in politics. It's one of the most obvious and it's one of the most frequently encountered factors in political history. Just go through it. Whether you talk about George III of England, or you want to talk about people like Nero and Caligula in Rome, or Ludwig II of Bavaria, in the time of, the 19th century. You can just go through it. Nuts have generally found their way rather easily to the corridors of power, and often the levers of power. Much of the time that's because so-called normal people have just decided they have nothing to do with self-government. They don't believe in it, they don't believe they have access to it. Sometimes that's true. But in any case, they're not related to the process. And so what happens is that they are ruled by the lunacy of their own inaction. People are governed by the lunacy of their own inaction. But then that has to be embodied. It has to be a lunatic, or a group of lunatics. They have to take power, they have to actually run things. Okay, so Putin is saying what he's saying here. And I now want to just say something about this. He says, during my conversations with American and European leaders, I always spoke of the need to fight terrorism together as a challenge on a global scale. We cannot resign ourselves to and accept this threat, cannot cut it into separate pieces using double standards. Our partners expressed agreement, but a little time passed and we ended up back where we started. First there was the military operation in Iraq, then in Libya, which got pushed to the brink of falling apart. Why was Libya pushed into this situation? Today it is a country in danger of breaking apart and has become a training ground for terrorists. Only the current Egyptian leadership's determination and wisdom saved this key Arab country from chaos and having extremists run rampant. In Syria, as in the past, the United States and its allies started directly financing and arming rebels and allowing them to fill their ranks with mercenaries from various countries. Let me ask, where do these rebels get their money? Arms? Military specialists? Where does all that come from? How does the notorious ISIL manage to become such a powerful group? As for financing sources, today the money is coming not just from drugs, production of which has increased not just by a few percentage points, but many-fold since the international coalition forces have been present in Afghanistan. You know, this is the head of Russia. I mean, this is Putin. He has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. This is what he just said a week ago. And if you weren't at this meeting, you would know that. Now, I'm not blaming you for not knowing it. I'm trying to tell you something that there's no discussion about this going on. The Sunday talking heads aren't talking about it. In America, the so-called Republican or Democratic parties are not talking about it. This is what he's saying. Now, he's also saying some additional things which I don't want to dwell on. I'll just reference. He said, this was yesterday, Russia will not drift into confrontation. He says, the world of the 21st century has not become more stable or more secure. The old threats have not disappeared, and in a number of regions, the situation has aggravated. Thus, a serious hotbed of tension remains at our borders. In the southeast of Ukraine, our military doctrine is defensive. Its main objective is ensuring the country's sovereignty, peace, and calm for our citizens. It is necessary to consistently implement all the plans for the improvement of the armed forces and other agencies responsible for national security. Now, if I had to translate that for you, what I would say is, you are being informed by him that you are in a situation similar to the world in August of 1914, when a lot of very clever people found themselves very cleverly pushing one another into what would become a global conflict in which most of them would be obliterated. I mean, most of the countries that started that conflict didn't exist at the end of it. They were all real smart people. They knew exactly what they were doing. So now, okay, having said that, let's say something about Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America, Argentina, other countries that are going another direction. There is an Ebola czar in America. You heard of this guy? His name is Klain. This guy got interviewed in 2008. Now, a lot of people are mad because they can't find him. I mean, basically, in the last 10 days in America, where all sorts of decisions are being made about Ebola, nobody can find this guy. And so, you know, the governor of New York is trying to do something, the governor of New Jersey is trying to do something else. The White House doesn't like it because they don't want people alarmed by the fact that Ebola kills you in 10 days, and like if you get it, you're likely to die. You know, but so, you know, people are a little upset. But the government thinks, no, that's a bad idea for you to be upset, because then that might imply that the United States doesn't have a public health care system that can deal with this. Well, it doesn't. The czar says this. This is an interview in 2008. I think the top leadership challenge in our world today is how to deal with the continuing growing population in the world and all the resource demands it places on the world and burgeoning populations in Africa and Asia that lack the resources to have a healthy, happy life. So there's something that we have to consider. You know, some people will say that the plans for the future include the elimination of black, brown, and yellow people around the world. There are people that believe that. Some people think that the diseases that are presently spreading are being allowed to spread as a result of that policy outlook. Some people don't think that, but there are also a whole lot of other people that are saying, regardless of whether that's true, what we're going to do in India is we're going to take our 1.2 billion people and we are going to make them not only competitive with, but the workforce for all of the rest of the world. That is what Narendra Modi specifically said at the Madison Square Garden in New York in September, at the end of September. He specifically stated that what he thought should be done. He said there are 650 million approximately Indians under the age of 35. 35, excuse me. And that represented the core of the wealth of India. Yeah, all those people, those teeming people. I've started to talk to someone about this, about a 28-year-old woman. She'd been in India, and she said, you haven't been there. You have no idea what it's like, the teeming people, the number of people. She became almost apoplectic. She was so terrified. Well, Modi's not. He's saying, no, this is our wealth because these young people have the capability to become anything. And we're going to make sure that they become the necessary doctors, teachers, engineers, and construction, city builders of the world. So that's his idea. The Chinese, of course, well, they're talking about mining helium-3 on the moon. For those that don't know what that means, I mean, that's like so far out. It's not so far out as in being theoretical. What it means is they're going to change the definition of value of all physical material resources on the planet by mining this substance on the moon that they're going to be using in thermonuclear fusion reactors. By the way, they and the Russians are building right now a hybrid fission fusion reactor, which the Russians have employed the Chinese for, and they've got all kinds of plans for this. These are the abandoned plans of the U.S. space program. So, of course, there's 1.5 billion people now in China. So that's, and not everybody's in that. There may be 300 million people rather, involved in that, 350 million. But that's what they're doing. Argentina's been very clear. Argentina has defied everybody. They defied the IMF. They defied the United States Federal Reserve. They've said that they are going to simply pay the debt that they believe they owe. And they have the sovereign right to do so. Now, a judge in New York tried to say to them, no, that's not right. You've got to pay various American companies that are demanding 1,610% profit. These hedge funds, basically, who bought, this bad paper, that they wanted to get the full value. So they went to court, and the judge ruled in favor of the banks. And Argentina just said, well, you know what? I mean, we aren't like the United States, so it doesn't mean anything. We're not doing it. And so what has happened is, and that's why Christina Kirchner said, if I'm assassinated, look north. So see, what is happening, and what I'm trying to suggest to you in terms of the picture, when we come back to this statement, progress is a nice word, but change is its motivator, and change has its enemies. Well, Robert Kennedy knew. When he decided to run for president, he told his father had had a stroke. His father couldn't talk. Joe. And Joe was in a wheelchair. And when Robert told his father he was going to run for president, Joe just turned to the wall. Just turned the wheelchair around to the wall. And Robert said to his father, "It'll be all right, Dad." See, we have to understand that with that said, there's another way to look at this. Malcolm X, in an interview once, was asked the question, what is the price of freedom? His answer was, well, the price of freedom is death. Now, you know, he didn't mean you have to die to be free. He meant that unless you're willing to die, you'll never be free. I mean, and by the way, I mean, that's sort of, I don't know, that everybody that's ever fought for this seems to know that. So this isn't some extraordinary idea. The problem comes in, though, when a state or an authority has not encouraged people to die. See, people really seem to not have a big problem with that. You get armies, and millions of people get in them, and they have rallies and all sort of thing, and they talk about the great thing. But when individuals who are moved by a principle of action on their own, when they seek to stand up, then there's this apparently some very great censure that comes into motion. Some great obstacle seems to be in their way. Ostracism is a lot of it. Huh? The social pressure to conform is a lot of it. Because after all, a mass army in a state, everybody is going, right? So therefore, if everybody joins, we're all joining together. We're all doing this together. But what if the price of freedom is the knowledge that what you're doing, which is right, may not be recognized by the society as a whole? Do you do it now? Is it different? And is it different where if it's recognized by a lot of people in another part of the world, but where you are, nobody does recognize it? They, as a matter of fact, hate people don't like you for it. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that it's necessarily that bad in North America, but I am saying to you that there's a kind of choice that I believe is before us all, and this is a good day to talk about it. The idea of changing oneself. I want to refer, just close with this. There's a dialogue written by St. Augustine. You know, it's an interesting person to talk about. I bring him up not because it's Sunday, but it happens to be Sunday. Therefore, we'll take the occasion, even though we're in a secular institution, to talk about. Well, we'll talk about Augustine before he had just become converted to Catholicism. Okay, so he wasn't really anything. He wasn't a bishop. He wasn't an official. You know, and he basically his mother had been after him, nagging him for years, and finally he converted. But his thing was that, wait a minute, you know, I can't really though get other people to do what I did if it's based on the doctrine of the religion, because first of all, I don't really know it that well, and second of all, that's just the question of belief. How would people know that what I'm talking about is true? Now, if I just tell you that I believe God is this way or that way, you should follow these rules, but how do you get to that? So he said, okay, you can't do it that way. So he has this idea, and listen to how he does this. It's in a dialogue. And he's talking to a young man, and they're going back and forth. He says, oh, well, you know what numbers are? The young man says, yes. He says, and you know what geometry, you know something about shapes and figures. And the young man says, yes. He says, okay, well, have you ever seen a circle? Yeah. And you know there's a line drawn through the center of the circle, or we would say there is a, you can fold the circle on itself, and you get what people call the diameter, the line through the center. Yes. So Augustine says this, he says, now if you make any other segment, it is any other fold or line drawn on this surface, it's going to be shorter than the one that goes through the center. Well, he says, yeah, makes sense. Says, and you could divide that circle, if the circle were big enough, you could just like keep dividing it, and you could make a whole lot of smaller segments, right? And they would be different in magnitude, each one than the other, because as they go toward the center, they get bigger, and as they go away from the center, they get smaller. He says, yeah. So Augustine says, now, so that means that if that circle could be as large as we could imagine, If we can imagine an infinite circle that was infinitely large, then you can make an infinite number of small lines, or smaller than the one that goes through the center. Young man says, yeah, so far so good, I don't see any problem. So then Augustine says, now the one that you make in the center, that you draw, if you started along any point on the edge, let's say where any of these other smaller lines are, they're all segments. And if you made that line that goes through the center, you started over here and you went through the center, or you start over here and you go through the center. So if you're at 12 o'clock, or you're at 3 o'clock, or 6 o'clock, or 9 o'clock along this, as long as you're going through the center, you're always making that same line, right? I says, yeah. Okay? So then Augustine says this. All right, now. So this means I can start, if this were the face of a clock, and along the face of this clock, we had, divisions, seconds, minutes, whatever you want to call it. But let's say that our clock has an infinite number of seconds on the infinite circle. So, okay, I can kind of see, he doesn't quite know where Augustine's going. And if I make this line that goes through the center, that's always the longest one, right? Okay, yeah. So I've got two different ideas of infinity. What? What do you mean two different ideas? Well, if I'm dividing the circle infinitely, this infinite circle, and all these smaller segments going to the center, right? They all go up to the center, but the center is different, right? Because the central one is the longest. Yeah. And I have no problem with that. So you have an infinite number of these, and you have this one. It says, yes, but I can make that line along any place on the edge, right? As long as I go through the center. So wherever I started on the edge, I've got an infinite number of places where I can start from. Okay, yeah. He said, okay, now, he says, relax. You know that that line drawn through the center of the circle is always the longest, right? Yes, we said this over and over and over. Yes, I know that's the longest line. He said, now, that would be true tomorrow or the next day or any time in the future, right? He says, yeah. And it was true in the past, right? Before today and a year ago and 10 years ago and 1,000 years ago, that was true. Yeah, true. So Augustine says, so it's always been true that the line drawn through a circle, the center, is the longest. Always been true. It says, yeah. He says, all right. I have a question for you. That idea about that circle is contained in your mind, right? I mean, you have no problem thinking about that idea. Young man says, yeah, I can think. I can think. We're talking about it. I must be thinking about it. Okay? So, your mind contains that idea. Yeah. But that idea is eternally true. He says, yeah, I guess so. It's always going to be true. Always was true. Then Augustine says, okay, let me ask you a question. You ever see water inside of a glass? Yeah. So the water inside of the glass is contained in the glass, right? Yeah. So the container surrounds the water in the glass. Yeah. Well, if this idea which is eternal is inside of your mind, which is bigger, your mind or the idea? If that idea is eternal, then the mind that contains it is eternal and it cannot be killed. Necessarily immortal. Now, something interesting here. People are not animals. Why? Yeah, but animals also have consciousness. I mean, you know, if you ever see a cat or a dog, if you ever have one, they can be super conscious. As a matter of fact, they have senses of humor. Matter of fact, they often try to train you to do things. So, you know, that's... But do they know that they are a cat species? Do they know they're a dog species? See, can they contrast themselves as a species to other species, except for, let's say, immediate enemies that they have? That's different. The human being is capable of thinking in terms of species of, not only other beings, but species of ideas. Finite ideas, infinite ideas, ideas in science, ideas in music. The thing that makes us capable of evolution of our own is not our biology. Yes, we need our biology to be here, but our cognition is now a geological phenomenon, so to speak. Our ability to think, just as for life, its ability to change the inanimate universe, because that's what you see in planet Earth. Life is the dominant form, geological proposition, geological phenomenon on Earth, unlike Mars or other places. And so we have a capacity. Now that capacity has been mystified by a lot of people, and there may be some reason to, depending on the culture, depending on the language, and so on, to put these ideas in different forms that make them accessible to different people in different ways. I don't have a problem with that. But what I want to suggest to you here today is that the issue that is implied in contrasting the view of Augustine, or I'd say here also Putin in a different way, or I'd say even what Kennedy is saying here about change. And I haven't tried to summarize these things, pull them all together, but what I'm trying to say is there's a different view of man, clearly, between the kind of statements I started with, that you heard, and the statement we just came to. The countries of Brazil and Russia and India and China, those are all different cultures, right? All completely different. But they're all in agreement on something that used to be called the idea of progress. You know, we used to call that, Americans used to have this idea of progress. So this idea of progress, I would submit to you, is the battleground, if you want to put it that way, for the decision as to whether or not the human race today is going to have the capability to supersede what appears to be its fate. To supersede that cyclical view of history we started with, which is only going to condemn us if we behave as animals will behave. That is, they have limited notions of their world. They have limited capability to act within that world. They may be dominant within that, but once those conditions are changed, they're unable to do more than at best adapt to the conditions. They can't change the conditions. But mankind can change the conditions. And the way you do that is you have a laboratory where you practice that. And that practice the laboratory you practice that is changing your ideas. You have dumb ideas or wrong ideas or limited ideas or inadequate ideas, whatever they are. You change them. You discard them. And you come by a new species of thought. And that species of thought is as real as biological species. And it's getting that across, that idea across, to the human race that has to be the task of regular people. Because I'll tell you right now, no government, except maybe the Chinese right now, who are sort of doing something from a Confucianist standpoint. They have a kind of conception. There's something in India emerging like that. There's these people who are going back to the ancient cultures And they're trying to say, let's go with these values that are congruent with our idea of human civilization. So I don't want you to have the idea, in conclusion here, that I believe that there's any great need for pessimism. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that, in fact, what are called so-called normal people, the people without portfolio, the people with no credentials, it's there that the actual destiny, the positive destiny of human beings is actually going to be shaped. It's with you that that actually lies. Poet Schiller said, the dignity of man lies with you. Protect it. With you it sinks, and with you it will ascend. And that is really the world that I believe we have to insist be the world, rather than the world of the predefined, predetermined ghosts, the vampires that stalk the night of our inactions. So I hope that gave you at least some idea of why I think it's at least a useful proposition to consider, to change some things that you may have been doing or not doing in favor of doing some things worth doing with some other people around the world that have now embarked upon that. And I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your All Souls Day.
Okay, we'll open for questions, comments. Please raise your hands, stand up, announce yourself, your name, and go ahead. Please.
Okay, so I just want to say, like, you read the school really well, and it's a nice process concerning not only the war, but the economics and all the progress that we brought into that should be treasured. And I think that you are very, you're a nice progress in society. To work as a progressive, motivated progress that is struck here in our city.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
My name is Guillermo, and I still have a question. I've read a lot of the socialist theory,
Yeah.
most of Oscar Wilde or Max Weber or
Yeah.
anything like that. Would the best scenario for society after some kind of, let's say, revolution or of taking of consciousness among the people, would the best scenario be a kind of socialist, equalitarian or libertarian society?
I think the way to think about this question is a good question, because a lot of us, well, I mean not a lot of us, but some of us have gone that route, you know, because I mean I go from the 70s, right? So, you know, we were in all that. You know, we were in socialism and communist organizations and all that. You know, it's good. It's good. I mean, you could meet all these people back in 68, 69, 70. You could go to the meetings of the Communist Party or the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, here's what would happen. You go to the meeting, right? And like, you're enthusiastic and this makes sense, and equality, and then you meet these people. And these people were like, you know, angry, depressed, you know, they treat each other like that, you know, and people like hustling each other. He's like, wait a minute now. I mean, the idea sounds good, but how come you're like this? It's the old thing like, I love mankind, but I hate people. You know? So like, that doesn't work. What we need is a world where the idea is, you take a principle of human creativity. I'll give you an example. People are complaining about China saying it's communism. Come on, you're dealing, first of all, that was Mao. And that was Mao doing something, Mao Zedong, doing something in the 1930s, similar to what Ho Chi Minh did. Ho Chi Minh was also, by the way, that's not his name, that's just a pseudonym, that's not even his name. And he used Marxism at a certain point but he was a national liberation freedom fighter. And he thought the United States was going to help him at the end of the war. And there's a famous case, I don't know if I've told this story before, but in 1944, he almost got killed, and a bunch of secret agents from the United States, from the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, parachuted in to Vietnam and saved his life, because he was working with the United States. So they were sitting around, they were actually drinking late at night, and one of the agents' name was Mitch Burbell, somebody that we met later, who he told us this story. And they're there, and Mitch loved bourbon. He would drink, you know, too much of it actually. But anyway, he's sitting there drinking this. And so they start, what's going to happen after the war? So, you know, Poe's achievements would be, you know, communist and all this. So Mitch is saying, that's no good, you know, Declaration of Independence, that's what you got to know. So he starts going to, we hold these truths to be self-evident and so forth. And basically, Ho Chi Minh recites the entire Declaration of Independence to him, to Mitch. On September 2nd, 1945, when they declared independence, that day, if you look at the document, it quotes, the first thing it quotes is, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So that's Ho Chi Minh. One of the more embarrassing problems of contemporary American society is if you really wanted to celebrate one of the major patriots of American values of the past 60, or let's say the past 100 years, you need to actually celebrate Ho Chi Minh. This will never happen, but this is what should occur. So you asked me a question, and that's what I'm answering it this way for a reason. I talked about JFK, John F. Kennedy. Well, Kennedy was not a communist. But what Kennedy was doing with the space program, what he was doing also with some of the other things he did, many of the other things he did, including actually ultimately opposing the war in Vietnam, that created the basis of progress for the United States of today. And Vladimir Putin often talks about Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, it was about 5-6 years ago when they had this 175th anniversary of Roosevelt's birth. Putin held over 100 celebrations in Russia for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, more than were held in the United States. So see, when we talk about forms of government, it's important to say something about the game that gets played and then to say what we should do. I'll tell you what I think we should do. In the United States, the most important person that we had probably on this was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. And what he did was he wrote these series of papers, and I won't go through what the details of them are, but it was under the Washington administration. So he was George Washington. He had worked with George Washington during the war. He was an adjutant to Washington. He was an artillery commander during the Revolution. So he traveled with Washington through all those battles, particularly when Washington was running up Manhattan Island from the British, all during 1776. They had to beat this retreat. Washington lost 90% of his army. He had 30,000 people by the time that was in July, and by December he had 3,000. And Hamilton was one of those. And the only reason they survived was because they had a surprise attack on the garrison at Trenton, and that turned the tide of the war. But Hamilton was at Trenton, and he was with Washington through all of these battles. Now, what Hamilton noticed by 1780, he said, listen, we got a problem. This is during the war. He said, we have all these different colonies, and all of them, they're different sizes. So Rhode Island is real small, Pennsylvania is real big. So Pennsylvania has taken on a tremendous burden of the war, but Rhode Island, because of its size, has had a lot less. If Pennsylvania has to pay back all the money that they borrowed for the war, no way, that doesn't work. So what we have to first of all do, we got to pool all the debt that we owe, and we got to have one country. So we pay the debt. So we're saying United States of America, that's real nice, and yes, we're confederated, but we've got to have a single way to pay all this back. Otherwise, we're going to break apart right after the war. So in 1780, Hamilton starts writing about the need for a national bank. Now this is kind of interesting because Hamilton is basically 23 years old when he's writing this. So when he's writing all those papers, now Ben Franklin had started it this kind of thinking, when he was 23 years old, that was like a lot earlier, 1729, he wrote a paper called The Necessity for a Paper Currency. And what he was saying is you need to have a way that people don't have to reach in their pocket for silver and gold all the time, so that they have a promissory note so the paper stands for the things that they want. All right? Now, why am I telling you this? A credit system is what has to be established all over the world right now. And that credit system, we do away with things like all the crazy student loans. Most of these things are insane, because most of these are interest payments. All of that should just be abolished. People say, well, wait a minute, what would that do to the economy? Actually, it would probably improve the economy, because what would happen is the students would have to stop worrying about having to pay this stuff and have to go on some sugar daddy's online or something to see if they get some old man to put them through college, you know, or some other thing. You know, because it becomes that desperate. Society becomes that weird when you have debt. So we need a credit system, and Hamilton is the one. Now, the Russians and the Chinese have no problem with that. Why? Because they have centralized economies. So they don't have the problem of worrying about all the debts that the rest of us will have to work, the credit card debt and the housing debt and all these other debts. People say, well, wait a minute, that's what powers the system. Oh, no. No, what powers the system is power, as in water power and electrical power and in, you know, manufacturing power and as in power, you know, real things. It's like, you know, people talk in the United States about healthcare policies, but the healthcare policy doesn't talk about doctors and nurses and hospitals and beds for the hospitals. That's a healthcare policy. It's physical. So that's my answer to you, because in other words, if you try to go with a form of government, yes, there's a need for a sort of a sovereign, independent, national form, because people speak different languages. And if you try to amalgamate everybody, which is what you just saw at the European Union, it doesn't work. I mean, unless you all know the same languages, but even if you do, you know, you really think in one or maybe two, and then you know you can speak, you can think but there's a mother tongue, so to speak. And you need nations so that when people are deliberating among themselves, they actually understand the nuance of what you're saying. They know, in other words, it's not the words you're saying, it's the nuance. It's the way you say it. It's the intonation with how you say it. That's how people know what you mean. Right? And we all know this, right? So that the nation state has a language culture associated with it. And that's why certain movements often around this, in my view, have been legitimate, including the one that they used to have back in Quebec at a certain point. There's a lot of things to say about that. People like Francois and other people like that know a lot more about that. You can say a lot more about it. I would just say to you all that on this question of what should be the form of society, the shape of the society should be that the society should be free. And to be free, you have knowledge. You have to know what it means to be free. So you have to know what the obstacles are, and what are the challenges facing our society. Okay, well, how can we get free of that condition? If you know that there are 2.5 billion people in the world that don't even have toilets, okay, or indoor plumbing, come on, I mean, we can say whatever we want about how we're bringing democracy to those people, but you know, they like to be able to flush once in a while, you know? I mean, and it may sound crude, but it's used for it to sound crude, because it is that crude. You're doing a thing to human beings that automatically lessens their dignity, but if you bring them those things, then if you say to them, I have a proposal for how we as a nation should govern ourselves, they're going to listen to you. Because you're obviously doing something in the interest of the people as a whole. Now, whether that is a socialist form or is a Republican form as the United States is supposed to be, which it is not now, I think the only thing that you don't do is you don't do monarchies. You don't do things which obviously consolidate power in a formal way, you know, before anybody even gets out of the box. You can't do that. I realize that even in communist and related societies, power is concentrated, but it's not officially or formally concentrated. So I think those forms of government are wrong. And I think that's the best answer I can muster at this point. Yes, sir.
How do you affect the change you're talking about?
Okay, good.
It's all understandable, but how do you start?
Okay, here's how we have to do it. And this is the key. What we got to do is we got to get everybody, basically, not everybody, anybody we can, basically between the ages of 18 and 35. The old thing they used to do with the draft, we got to do that because the only people who really have a seriously vested interest that is palpable, right, in change are the young. Now, it doesn't mean the old don't want to see it. I'm old. I want to see it. But on the other hand, the truth is, what am I going to do this like another 10 years without a driver? Maybe I can get one. I don't know. I can get one here. No, I'm just saying, there's a limited period of time where I'm going to be able to like do what I'm doing. And there is clearly less time in my life than there has been. This isn't, to me, a tearjerker or something. I mean, it just happened. You know, and I've been trying to fight doing this as Linda LaRouche and Bob Hucks and other people who were here. We've been trying to do this for 30, 40 years. People say, well, wait, but how do you feel about that? I mean, have you guys been failing? No. Because why? Because the ideas that we represented are now in the minds of and being represented and expressed by a lot of people from around the world. I won't go into this. You can look at our literature. You'll see, you know, the statements from Russia and China all acknowledging what we've done. But we are we're the beneficiaries only if people are 18 years old, 20 years old. That's where it has to be. So it's a cultural shift we have to make, like Narendra Modi was saying. So here's how I see it. There's a title, only the title, I like it, in the book I mentioned before to some people, Project for a Revolution in New York. You know, the city of New York has 50 million people that come through it every year, tourists mainly, but also people from around. So if you're in New York, if you're on 59th Street and Broadway, you get the whole world. Everybody's coming by. Okay, so since the UN's there, and the bad guys at Wall Street are also there, you can use the fact of that intersection, that global intersection, to make a change, not just by, oh, let's recruit people in New York. No, you use it as a point of reference, a fulcrum. And I would propose that we do that between Montreal and New York, for example. Or even between, let's say, Chicago and New York would be nice too. Or Paris and New York, that's existed for a long time. People have been doing that anyway. But that's the conception, because why? See, there are things I have no idea about that are happening either to be in Russia or other countries, which are extremely important for all of the rest of us to know. Important developments, whether it's in science or technology or culture or whatever. I don't know what they are. But the people from those countries do. And if they interact with people who are 16 or 17 years old, who are from my country or other countries, see, they can together, right, make an alliance that can supersede the old bad ideas of people like me, who may have bad ideas not because we intend to have them. We may just have bad ideas because we've been around a long time. You know, as they say, memory almost full, right? So to flush that out, you need very young people because they don't start from the premises you start from. So the disappointments you've had in your life, which have been real, for example, or like, you know, a lot of our people went to jail with Linda LaRouche at a certain point. My wife was indicted with him. She was on probation for 15 years. All the charges were dropped. But the intent was to try to crush her, and crush me, and others of us, right, by doing that to us. Therefore, there are scars that has, whether you're aware of them or not. You can deny them. But you know, young people who didn't go through that were just, well, why don't we just do this? Why don't we make this change? That's what we have to do. And that's the only efficient way in a short period of time to effect change.
Do we have to do it politically?
Yes, I'm going to come to you in just a certain. Yes, but the nature of politics is the sense of the future that these, you know, I saw this thing. I shouldn't have been watching it, but I stayed up last night watching this idiot thing on CNN. Because it was wild. There was this hour-long show about these young women who were doing this thing I mentioned. I was completely knocked out. Because they just conclude, look, there is no way out. I mean, there's no future at all. I got this young guy, he's taking me out, and he can't even buy dinner. This is terrible. Right? So now they find themselves, they have to consider doing something which was being done for a long time anyway. I mean, this has been going on for time immemorial. But now you have to make like a national cottage industry out of it because there's no place to actually grow and develop. Oh, now this is awful. So the issue to me is, yes, it's political because you take that. Now, with the 40 years we've had of feminism and post-feminism, that's what we're reduced to? That's what it all meant? So by showing people that their action in unison to effect a change is their only real power. You see? Then you can create a moralization so that this idea of a future for the society becomes available to them. And that's what I think we have to do. So I'm sorry, I you got a question.
Just for a few minutes, my English is not bad, but maybe it's better. I'm looking, I listen to you with big attention because I'm 64 years old. I came at age of 32 in capitalism, from refugee camp of disaster war, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. Imagine I didn't mind. I'm from Romania. I come from a family with a father very strong, like the father was a veteran of war, came alive back, and told me the real history of the war and the real one, who was backward. I'll make the quotation. I'm very proud because half of life I lived in communism and half of life here in Canada. Beautiful country, I love it. But when I watch television, and probably they are afraid or they don't know how they treat this change in these countries. How can function when we are the product of environment? Even China and Russia and Romania, all that countries. Just imagine the children of proletariat who are in power became bourgeois overnight. If you know a little bit history, you know who said, my God, the proletariat devient bourgeois. And it is that. Money changed from a country to other. I don't want to talk that many people know that the same people, they change, they move money. Wouldn't be communists. They are built in revolution. It wasn't finance. Even what impressed me very much is that people start, and I start to wake up, and I told myself, I don't want to die like tomorrow. I have a daughter, 40 years old, I pass so many. I want to leave something. Just a few days ago, by the way, I'm a professional musician, I was crying, and I said, you, God, if you exist, punish people there who made me to leave my country, and who makes back to humankind, because you didn't want this to happen. Sometimes we fall to the other side. I would like to tell you something. I'm so surprised in Canada. Nobody from all politicians is, what's going on there? That became billionaire overnight. A billionaire here or a millionaire. There are people who work very hard. They work hard for this money, even if they make some. And they came overnight billions and billions of dollars. And you can say nothing. I give an example about the Romanian president. I'm not afraid. I'm afraid of him and myself. But I love my parents who are my gods. And sometimes I cry. I want my father to be. I said, God, give my father 5 minutes and take my life. I give my life. I wanted to and I said, how come that he stole everything, sold over 300 ships? How come another one who was minister was here? And I wanted to say, okay, what's going on with this world? The start, I think, start with criticism. We have to come here. Yes, sir, to start with criticism. If you criticize something in Canada, I was talking to another one, say, go back where we came. Many people came in that time from my country by container. And they said, go back. I said, so yeah, this is the by container in Canada. I just came with a bigger plane and let's start this. I don't want to say different things. West absorbing lots of capital, lots of educated people. Studies are not recognized. From doctors, engineers, there are many things happen here. I don't want to say that by the way, I take courses. Now I went back to school and in the morning teach all colors. And I laugh people. And I see what face they are. You look, everybody like this, go. Everybody afraid to say something. We have things to correct. First, we have to communicate. It's not a philosophy, I said. We have to start to have courage. Even we criticize to have courage. Sir, it's like this, like this. I know how communism was built. I know how capitalism, I know how it's feminism. I pass a little bit by that. But like his brother said, starts with you to do something new. I don't see so many Canadians. By the way, sir, sorry that I look at here, how many are just even all the places. You know, it's true. Even all philosophy is Jesus started like that. But I think this has to be with a television station or something. But even that, if you date, by the way, you have to have a license, because why? If you give up many things, it's so difficult to come. Why I'm talking, I start here, because I want the change, not for me, for your child, for everybody. I have a child. I love and I see, and I have friends of all colors. And I've seen, believe me, I was in refugee camp, deserter of war in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. And the Canadian government sponsored, brought me here, because they saw that I'm a good citizen. And I work like crazy, and I have nothing. When I wanted to fight, because I don't want to say I was in court 2.5 years because somebody wants money, and the judge was so smart. He said, sir, go. And I listened to the door when the judge told me, do you know what means this guy, if he sued the town or you, if, with his courage and his sincerity? There are so many things has to be correct. That means we have to start with us.
Cry when it's tough, so.
Thank you.
I won't, I just will say the following quickly. You have to realize one thing, I think, not just you, but everybody. You know this story, old Bible story about Gideon's army. You hear that story? 10,000 people start out, and he ends up, guy keeps saying, you got too many people. You got too many people, you know, and they go down to the river. He says, listen, everybody that just gets in and just puts their face in the water, none of those people, don't take any of those people. Right? And it keeps going on until basically he's only got like 300 people. He says, okay, now you got the number of people you need. Now, I'm saying that because this may be too many people. The issue is not the numbers that you're seeing. It's the power of the idea. It's just like the line drawn through the center of a circle. Okay? That's the most powerful. All the other infinity of divisions that you have don't mean anything. It's important to realize that when one human being sees themselves as a human being, that one human being is enough to liberate millions of people. And that's what we've seen in history. And you know, often people get too reverential about it. You know, oh, Martin Luther King was such a wonderful person. Well, I don't know, he was probably a good person, and he could do wonderful things, sure, but I don't know. Malcolm X. Well, Malcolm X was not actually that wonderful person, but he changed. It was his change that was wonderful in Malcolm's case. I mean, Malcolm was teaching that white people were devils, okay? 4 years before, you know, he goes to Mecca and he does what he does. So, Malcolm was wrong about almost everything. But the thing that he was right about was his changes, when he was saying, yeah, I was saying this was crazy, Okay? This is what I think now, and this is why. And that's the thing to be admired about him. And you could go on like that. Gandhi, of course, is a completely different thing. You read his autobiography, many of you know this, he says, it's not what you think, people are telling me I'm this great political leader. I'm not. He said, the thing I can tell you I did was all these things I did with myself, which are my experiments with truth, most of which I failed at. And it's these failures, and it's my focus on why I'm failing at these things, which accounts for anything I did politically. See, so when a single person sees themselves as a human being and acts on that and allows that to flow through them, you know, that changes millions. And so I understand why you said what you said, but you know, actually,
But, sir,
hold on, because we're doing some other people. Because you're a musician, right? Then you should know this. See, when a string quartet is playing, everybody ever look at a cello, violins, right? They don't look like a guitar. A guitar has frets. You know, it tells you where you put your fingers, kind of, right? Can't do that on a violin. Can't do that on a cello. Can't do that on a viola. So how does the string quartet know how to play in tune? They're not just playing in tune because they were trained to play the violin. The four of these people have got to be in tune. And the intonation and how they play has got to tell them where the piece is going. And they develop within themselves their own tuning to not just the piece they're playing, not just the ears of the people they're playing for, but the medium through which they're playing, the actual air in which that they're causing to vibrate. They got to have this. Now, what do? Do they sit and think about this? No, they play. And they get used one to the other, right? Now, so this is a quartet. So these people can convey the message, right? That's on these pieces of paper, these dead pieces of paper with these funny little scratches on them. They can make this come alive. And they make that violin, they can make it dance. They make this dead wood and the dead strings dance. Because what they do is they make them sing. Now, what's my point? The idea is that inside of everyone, every human being is an instrument. Every human being is an instrument. And the issue involved is merely to discover how that individual is capable of expressing through his voice what is in my or other people's minds, or souls, if you want to use that term in this case, how that expression plays inside of my mind. That's what they're doing. See, we don't really, you know, when I'm speaking right now, you're not really hearing me. You're thinking faster than what I'm saying. You'd have to be. Otherwise, how could you even interpret you know, you'd be behind the curve of what I'm saying. The actual words, in other words, are actually not occurring in your mind. You're not assimilating what I'm saying and sort of taking it in, soaking it in, and then turning it over in your mind, and now you're registering the phenomena, the vibrations of the air and all. That's what scientists say. It ain't what's happening. The communication is more than instantaneous. So what I'm trying to say is that can't be possible unless the ideas I'm talking about are somehow already in your mind. So the notion that somehow I know this and you don't know this, that's got to be wrong. Now, I may be saying things that are wrong, you see, and you can, you know, criticize that. But the notion that you're somehow behind, you know, I'm the stimulus, you're the response. No. Can't be happening. Can't be what's occurring. You say, well, that sounds mystical. Yes, but what I'm trying to say to you is that it's only mystical because we don't know what it is. It's not mystical because it's a mystical process. And I'm suggesting to you that this is the change we have to have with communication among our people. So that they don't think there's a leader and then we're all following. No, we're all trying to figure something out. We're going to let someone lead. Someone's going to speak for us, yeah. But that's only because they're being given that authority by us at that moment, because they can resonate something more transparently than the rest of us. But it's all of us talking if it's true. Now that's when you have a society in forward motion. And that's when people will trust leadership. Sometimes, of course, people make mistakes. But my issue in saying all this here is change is straightforward. There's never a problem with change. You don't need numbers for change. You need to change. And if you change, people respond to that.
To be ready for that.
Yeah, I have a quick comment and then a question.
Please, go ahead.
As far as numbers are concerned and social change, ideas are wonderful, and it's really the way that you change the individual, but it's typically through a crisis or some sort of social stress or pressure or anxiety of the population where numbers actually come, when people are complacent, when they're comfortable in their day-to-day life. Why would they change?
Right.
There has to be a crisis. That's all I have to say.
Sure.
To go back to the thing that you're talking about, the hospitals and the toilets, it sounded like, I'm not too familiar with the Hush movement, but it sounded like you were talking more about having a resource-based society of some sort, and the political structure wasn't as important as far as having the necessities taken care of people in a society.
Okay, let me say the following. We've written a lot of things, and I won't go through them.
Yeah.
But just indicate. The problem is the following. You have to be able to know how, if you had the opportunity tomorrow to reorganize the globe's economy, exactly what you would do. Now, when you look at it, there's certain things you know. Water, power, medical care, education. There's certain basic things that we know that people have to have. Housing. Okay, for these things, many countries and many states and countries have already done plans, programs, policies. They have this. Now, the problem, though, is you need a workforce to carry that out, and you also need credit for the purpose of getting the raw materials, refined materials, and then what's called a bill of materials of what you need, and then a process sheet, a bill of consumption for your workforce, these things. Now, many people who've done planning have tried to figure out the following problem. How do you know when you invest a, quote, certain amount of money, we'll come back to this issue, that you're going to get a certain physical result? Well, the answer is you can't know from the money. All you can know is by having a flow of what's really called credit, which is not the same as money. It can be related to money. You may monetize credit. But the issue is that, in the case of the United States, this is in the Constitution of the United States. And in the case of China and Russia, they're continent-wide nations. They've got centralized banking capability. So what they can do is they can say, okay, we just direct and we're going to put this much investment into this area, these sectors. Okay. Well now, we do know this. When we look at the world, we know that, for example, taking things like hydrogen-based automobiles, electric cars, so forth and so on, high-speed rail, there is really no need for fossil-based, right, travel capability. I mean, this is ridiculous, okay? It should just be ended. There's certain other things. For example, the fact that the electric car, the old trolley cars, there was a movement in the turn of the century to get rid of them by Firestone and other. That's what happened. Obviously, they worked. So the things of that time, right? Much of this is what stuff that we, or those of us from our movement and others, can give any group of people that want to have it. And particularly with young people, because you see, most of the games that are being run on that level. So, and that's something we would do in another form and also in individual discussion. So, just to say, normally, that's like what we would be talking about, what we do. That's the programmatic side of things. But what's needed, let me put it real simply. If you had 1,000 people between, let's say, the New York and Montreal areas, with about, let's say, 2/3 of them under 25 years old, I'd say, who were all like studying these things, talking about this, just going to individual meetings, intervening and stuff, within a very short period of time, these ideas will begin to be echoed by all kinds of people in their own way. See, they won't actually repeat what we're saying. They'll say something completely different or related, but it will sound completely different. That's good. Because when you really look at it, you will never make a revolution, particularly if you're talking about North America, and particularly, let's take the United States. Nobody has to ever be worried about the Americans going like the Germans, because the Germans were way too organized. I mean, Americans are not that organized. That ain't gonna happen. I mean, they'll do a different thing. It's a different kind of fascism, okay? Which is sort of thing you're seeing now. That's what you'll see. But it won't be organized, okay? They're not that. You can't get. And I'm saying that because that's what I think we have to understand is our capability. We have an opportunity. This is a moment of opportunity. Putin and others are saying, we're at this turning point. Then there's other people who are saying, hey, we're at a positive turning point. Some people in China and some other societies. I referenced this thing with Barack Obama. I didn't go through it. I think if you're here, you must know what we think. We're saying he should be removed from office. But what are we really saying about that? Yeah, that might happen. It also might not happen. The real issue is to neutralize the policies with which he's associated himself. Apparently his entire life. So, boom, that's all. And the way to do that is you must activate the people. And the people is not a particular party. Forget that. That's a completely dead end. It's a form of dialogue and discussion and action based on that. Whether that means we go to other people, demonstrations, we do things like that, whether it means conferences, whether it means intervening in elections. There are many different forms it can take, but that's got to be the direction. Just over here.
I see this main issue we discussed here is elected people. But the problem is the hijacking of the administration that's going on right now. That's like stopping this change and making it kind of like a bit idealistic in a way. I was like, you made me think of like an expression that said, how can you win their game playing their rules?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, like, me as young spirits, when you start talking about leadership and leaders, I kind of like think about something else in the same time, because I'm a web developer and program developer, and I use open systems where the hierarchy is horizontal, and that's where I'm trying I'm going to meetings like this one to try to find ideas that goes toward that, not in perpetuating the old system that has a rule that's been passed by people that try to sabotage that same system.
Okay, so the way to do that is think in terms of, I'll give you a term, but then I think you can do something with this. Concentric circles. Here's how you do this. See, there's no way to avoid that. The way that people deliberate is in small groups. You can have large communities, but when people actually deliberate, when they actually start to talk or think, they hold in their mind not too many more than 40 to 50 people, about the size of an extended family. It's just the nature of how people function in the culture. Now, with respect to certain capabilities, which you will know what I'm referring to. You know that 90% of the net is not the net that people use, for example, right? So you know these things. Okay, so now the idea is you can create informal forms of organization that are only intended for certain limited purposes and evaporate after that purpose. Now, the way you do this, all right, if you take a certain principle, certain idea, let's take something very simple. Right now, there's 28 pages in a document, right, which was this Senate Intelligence Committee, right? Now, what it was is this talks about Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11. Now, here's what people get into who get this messed up. They say, wait a minute, but we don't even know whether 9/11 happened the way they're saying, and the fact that 19 hijackers, and whether that was all just false flag, blah, blah. Yeah, that's true. We don't know. But here's what we do know. We know that somebody doesn't want those pages released, and we know that the Saudis keep yelling and screaming about it, and we know that the Saudis are central to the entire ISIS and related stuff, and we know that there's a deal between the Saudis and British intelligence going way back, where they put together a form of an over $1.5 billion slush fund. Okay, no, I'm sorry, $100 billion slush fund. which has been financing terrorism and other kinds of stuff all over the place. We know this, right? So the 28 pages, we just want to force them to release the pages. Now, is what's in the pages that important? Could be, might not be. Might not be. But the issue is this. What happens if a group of people just come together for the purpose of getting those 28 pages? They force the pages out. And certain other things the rest of us know are true now are able to be discussed because people have the 28 pages. Let me explain what I mean. See, we know British intelligence was at the center of what happened on 9/11. We know that there were elements of Israeli intelligence. We know there's people from the Saudi thing, da-da-da. Now, we're not going to stay, we'll be doing this for another, like the people with the Kennedy assassination, 40 years from now, right? If we sit around trying to, so forget that. We don't want that. So the way that the thing has to work is that you have a diversity of organization where people pick up on that thing I just said, for example, and in various ways, using capabilities that they have, they create motion to get these pages. Now, there's ways to do that, and we could discuss that. So, why is that important? Party organization is dead. It's completely dead. So, those forms of organization are going to prove that they are obsolete. If you're going to change the society today, you will change it in ways that I would say to you, if we were talking, and we may be able to do that afterwards, ways that are congruent, let's put it this way, with what you're talking about. The small groups are going to do it. Small groups in nations, 35, 40, 50 people getting together, doing certain things on certain legislation. Some things won't be that. A lot of things won't even be in the realm of legislative work. A lot of stuff's going to be social action. And so that's where we are already. I agree with you on that, and I would just say there's more that we could discuss. So this may look very top-down. It does have that. But from the standpoint of implementation, it's very horizontal.
We have a nice momentum here in Quebec. We have the cops teaming up with the students finally. And that's a good mix. Usually for change. Push change. Right way. We're not negotiating.
They have stickers.
I know, but you just people may also just let's ask them what they want to do. What you should just intervene, just ask, because I don't know. You know, if there's still questions, great, I'm fine, but I don't want to
Well, there are questions, we can keep having them, but I think if we don't, then we can disperse in small groups and break the top-down structure and go to the table, grab material, get subscriptions, or to organize your friends and continue this process to the next day and every day forward. Any other questions or comments?
I mean, I'll just say a couple of things in summary, maybe. Here's what I'd like you to do, especially coming off that last exchange. And just anybody has other things, I have no problem talking about whatever. But I just figure, hey, it seems like we reached a certain inflection point for people. So let's say a few things. Okay, so our organization has been around a long time, but it's going through a certain transition. Lyndon LaRouche does these webcasts every week. You can look on there and see his point of view, what he's had to say, and how he's advanced certain ideas. There are people in different countries that have really come around and they converge on a lot of what he has to say. What I think is important for all you right here to think about is, let me give you a simple game, and one that you can do something about. Here you'd have to talk to Bob Hucks about this. Then there's another kind of game you have to talk to Matthew about. But two games to be considered for Canada. There was a game around thermonuclear power. It started getting played in the 50s. It was already known when they built the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, that the next thing that would be done would be to convert that to energy for peaceful purposes. But if that happened, the problem was fossil fuels were going to go out the window. There's going to be no need any longer to argue about oil and other things. So what was done was that Eisenhower, when he was president, tried to outrun the military-industrial complex of the United States by a program called Atoms for Peace. But he was unable to outrun it because he was trying to do it from the inside, and it wasn't going to work. It couldn't work in that way. Nuclear fission power was then demonized as the enemy because of the waste products that it does in fact produce. But that was never the intention. The intention was thermonuclear fusion from the 50s. So then the environmentalist movement got developed for the purpose of focusing everybody on nuclear fission and what was wrong with it. And many of the things that were being said were right about what was wrong with it. And the fact that you now have plants that are 70 years old, which you don't need 70-year-old nuclear power plants. Why would you do that? You could have rebuilt and built much better plants, etc. Now, so some people understand that, like Paul Morse and these other guys sort of who used to be environmentalists that came around. But what people don't understand is what the game was and is. The game is that, see, China's going to develop that. Russia's going to develop that. The only places it won't get developed are here. What's happening is that their whole focus on energy and power, which is geostrategic as a world as a whole, is money. The manipulation of money and debt. So it's debt which is the issue, not even money itself, not even making money. Making money is not what they're about. It's about the manipulation of debt to manipulate all the populations of the globe. So now there's a case where, particularly you should talk to Bob Bucks, those of you who are interested in this, because this is something we can do a lot about, because there are people moving in the opposite direction toward thermonuclear fusion. I'm saying you need a hydrogen-powered economy. The electric car thing I already talked about. Magnetically levitated trains. You go out of the entire consumption of fossil fuels. So that's one game. A second game is you need to know the history of how police actions were done in Quebec, going back to the time of the Parti Québécois and that whole thing in the Trudeau period. The reason to know this is, it's like that game that they were doing in Ottawa. We happen to have been in Ottawa days before. And then the game starts. And the game is about getting Canada fully committed to what's called the Five Eyes policy. But the Five Eyes is itself is shorthand for something else. Think of what it is. It's New Zealand, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's England. What?
Commonwealth.
Yeah, right. Or what used to be called the English-speaking Union, as they used to call it. See, these are racial theories going back to Cecil Rhodes. That's what this stuff is all about, right? Because in Cecil Rhodes' last will, his notion was always to reincorporate the United States into the British Empire, which he says in there. Just get a copy of his last will and testament. There's several of them he wrote. But that's what he was always doing. That's what this all is. Yeah, I talked to you a lot about the United States, but notice I put Bertrand Russell, Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley, S.I. Starr. Why? Because that's what the truth is. The Americans were manipulated, yes. I don't mean they're guiltless. I just mean that they were manipulated, like the Babylonians manipulated the Persians back in 550 BC. That's how the Persian Empire became the Persian Empire. They were the martial lord, but they were not the people making up the ideas. The ideas come out of London, the muscles from the United States. So this is a second game. So I'm giving you these two examples, but you should talk to Matthew and you should talk to Bob, because these are things that we need to think of ways that we can counter, just as two examples. So I want to thank everybody for coming. We're doing an event down in New York City on Saturday, this coming Saturday. I want you guys to come, anybody that can. This is a specific event. Happens to be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall. It's actually, though, intended to start the process I talked about earlier. And I want you all to come and see people in the back about it. And I think that that's very important. I also think that people should contribute to the movement up here. If everybody here gives a small contribution, that can be $20 or whatever it may be, that all helps. Maybe some of you guys are doing more. But the notion is, just by having a small amount of money and a small amount of resources, we're able to power this process. And I think what's important is get the student side of it particularly revved up, so that what we can do is get not just the new generation of people. You always say that, you need a next generation. No, it's not that. It's that right now in the world, because of the internet still being relatively open, a little bit, right? You can interact with people all over the globe relatively instantaneously. And the only way that you'll get a social change of the type that those of us 40 years ago tried to fight for and didn't manage to do, the way you'll get it is by using that capability now. So that's the last thing I'll say. Thank you.
Thanks.
become universalized policy. Now, it's interesting to think about this thing in the Congo, therefore, from that standpoint. Because HIV is not something that you can't notice, you know. I mean, it's not like if a lot of people are dying of something like that people wouldn't actually know that that was going on if they were part of a colonial regime in Congo. I mean, you would see the people dying. So, the idea that it didn't become known until 1960, which is what the article says, I'll cite that in a moment so you just know, I like to document things so people don't have a sense that I'm trying to exaggerate for my point. You may not agree with my point, but you will never be able to prove or demonstrate that I didn't tell you why I said what I said. You may not like the conclusion I draw, but the conclusion will be based on what people are saying about these things. So the Catholic Church has always been a big force. I'd like to go to the next picture now. This character you probably don't know, and he's one of the most important people to your life. His name is George Bundy. George Bundy was the National Security Advisor to President John Kennedy. And one of the major architects of the Vietnam War. If you go online, you can look him up. There's been a book written about him recently. I don't think I have it here. I'll just reference it. You can take a look at it yourself. And the book describes how George Bundy, after he died in 1996, he was born in 1916, died in 1996. And the 1990 he was born, excuse me. And the book basically describes that George Bundy had he thought of his policy toward the Vietnam War as being wrong, but he never really thought about the population consequences of it. Matter of fact, he at one point proposed during the war that the United States should commit a very large number of ground troops there. He said, because it's better for us to lose the war by fighting the war with ground troops than to lose the war without fighting it with ground troops. Now, you try to figure that out. I mean, I'm still, that's Rumsfeldian to me, if you know what I mean, right? The unknown knowns and the knowns unknowns. Remember that Donald Rumsfeld back in the day of the 20 years ago with the war, they asked him about the Iraq war. That kind of logic, insane logic coming from these people. Now, why he's important, though, is that I want to cite something about what he did after he worked for Kennedy. He became the head of the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation is like one of these, well, there's a Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, Carnegie Mellon Foundation. And foundations are the way in which government policy is run through non-governmental organizations. It's the way in which you also recruit people who are not part of a government structure into the extended policy implementation of a government. And you finance them so that they do what you want them to do. So I just want to cite something here. In 1964, Bundy was still in the government. Kennedy had been assassinated, Johnson came in, and Bundy headed something called the 303 Committee. This was the committee that handled all covert action deployments of American intelligence. This doesn't just mean foreign intelligence, it meant anything going on in the United States. He transferred to the Ford Foundation a year later, and what he did was he carried out the same intelligence operations he was carrying out, the famous one being the My Lai Massacre, Operation Phoenix operation. So that I don't go too fast and people know what I'm talking about, some people who go back that far would know that during the Vietnam War at one point, there was an exposure of an assassination of a whole village that was done, My Lai Massacre. And that exposure happened in 1969-70, but what it was part of was a program called Operation Phoenix. And the notion here was once described by an American general as, we had to destroy the village in order to save it, which is an actual quote. Look online. That was their notion of the way in which they would create, if you will, democracy or freedom in various societies in various parts of the globe. That is what you just saw in Afghanistan. That is what you have seen in Iraq. That is what is about to happen in Syria. That is what will happen any place where the present set of policies is continued and extended. Because it is policy which acts. It is the ghost of policy. It is not individuals. In the case of the United States foreign policy, and I'll come back to saying why I say that in a minute. But I'm citing these various quotes to you about depopulation and so on for a reason. I will here go to, let's go past New George Money for a minute. Henry Kissinger. Okay, everybody knew this. And I take this up because across the world, so to speak, in China, in India, also in Russia to some degree, and in some other countries, in Argentina also, people don't feel this way. People in those countries increasingly believe they have a sense of an optimism about the future. But in Europe and in North America, no future societies. Societies where young people, particularly young women, for example, there have been various specials. You can look at CNN and these other things. You know, you have these 20-year-old young women who basically are sort of hawking themselves in various ways on the internet to be subsidized by 40 and 50-year-old guys because they basically don't want to be with any 20-year-old guys because they have no money and they have no future, just like the young women have no future. So their basic thing is, let me hook up with this guy. I'll try to more or less, you know, tease out of him a certain amount of money and so on. Or maybe he's just completely lonely and he'll subsidize me. There are 1 million people, 1 million students in North America signed up and involved in various websites doing exactly what I just told you. Yeah, 1 million. So now that's a society which has condemned not only a generation or two, but itself to a kind of ignominious end. What T.S. Eliot once said, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. You just go crawling off crying in a hole in a corner. And that's how you die. But that's not the way that China thinks of itself. It's not the way that Narendra Modi thinks of his people. And I don't think it's the way that we should think about the West. So what we're going to do quickly here is just show you a set of characters who are going to figure in what I'm going to be telling you. And so we'll just run through this quickly sort of as a prelude. And because I'm not really good at, I don't like to go back and forth with visuals and audio stuff and so on. I find that to be too free associative rock music-like. I want to basically show you these people, and then I want you to recognize that they're here in the room haunting it as I speak. And then that'll be the easier way for us to go through today's narrative. So that's Bertrand Russell. That's Julian Huxley. He's the brother of famous writer Aldous Huxley. He was the first head of UNESCO, United Nations Education, Social and Cultural Organization. Let me just give you a couple of quotes from these people, because I just want to have a sense, give you a sense of something that we're going to be discussing. Some of you know that on October 2nd, the London Daily Mail ran a story claiming that a set of researchers had established that the HIV set of retroviruses actually originated in Congo in the 1920s, and that nobody noticed because nobody cared to notice until sometime after basically the late 60s, and then into the period of the early 80s when it was finally diagnosed. And therefore, people like the economist Jeffrey Sachs down at Columbia University said last Tuesday night at a forum that we attended that millions of people had died in Africa and people just didn't know because they didn't care. And they had died of that disease. And he was making the analogy to Ebola and what was going on now in West Africa, around which he had been trying to raise money for months. For 10 months, he was trying to raise money to address that situation, and nobody would give him any money. And he was shocked because he's a very good fundraiser. And his conclusion was that people just didn't care. Now, for a moment, going back to Bertrand Russell, just he had, back in 1923, wrote something called The Prospects for Industrial Civilization. And I want to here do some quoting of people, not to be boring and not to sort of even prejudice the situation. I just want you to hear some people speak in their own words about a few things. He said in 1923, the white population of the world will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will be longer and the Negroes still longer before their birth rates fall sufficiently to make their numbers stable without help of war and pestilence. Until that happens, the benefits aimed at by socialism can only be partially realized, and the less prolific races will have to defend themselves against the more prolific by methods which are disgusting, even if they are necessary. Now I come to, that was 1923. Now this is Julian Huxley. This is a quote from him. This is, you can get this online. London Spectator, November 1924. It's an article he wrote. He says, not until you have lived in the southern states, he's British, not until you have lived in the southern states, or at least lived somewhere in contact with Western veneered Negroes, can you realize at all adequately what the Negro problem means to America. Even when you stop only a few minutes in some little country town where the blacks outnumber the whites, you are apt to experience.
Okay. Well, everybody, welcome to the CRC event, Committee for the Republic of Canada. My name is Matthew. I'm a full-time political activist with CRC and the Schiller Institute. This conference is very, it's a part of our daily mobilization every day against imperialism, against the empire, against the war, against the economic crisis, and everyday fight to present solutions. Because I'll give a very short introduction to set the tone, and then I'm going to get Dennis Speed to speak to all of us. But what you have right now in the world is a very desperate push for war. Not just regional conflicts, although they do play into that, but a desperate push for world war. And the reason for the war is something that has been unleashed specifically around the BRICS process. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa process. With different projects, different programs like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the various projects like the New Silk Road, a commitment to make fusion commercially viable for these nations and for the rest of humanity. And so the idea of the BRICS process is not another free trade agreement deal like the TPP or NAFTA, but a more perfect Westphalian system of nations, of cultures coming together for the betterment of all of humanity. That is something right now which, when the empire watches that, which is the London Wall Street Empire, specifically the Anglo-Dutch British Empire, when they see that, they freak out. Because what they see is their total defeat and annihilation in that process. And this is something, in this process, our role in Canada is very important. Because we have a chance right now to really shift our politics and our cultural outlook towards the future, which means breaking Canada from the empire, ideologically, economically, and moving towards developing itself in collaboration with other cultures, other nations, specifically Russia, India, China, South Africa, Brazil. So, because we're at a point where you have a point where both systems cannot coexist. You have to have one system go extinct. The empire is itself self-destructive, but it also is in a position to unleash global chaos and war. And what you have on the other side is the humanist system of BRICS, the humanist system of LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which is not extinct yet, but it is also not fully functioning, especially in our culture here in the Western system, where the problem isn't that you have people dying in Syria or Palestine or Iraq. The problem is you have a population that's soul dead, that watches that and says, man, what can we do? That goes to protest in thousands of numbers against budget cuts and then gets wasted in the evening at some stupid Halloween party, and that's life. So we need to ideologically shift ourselves to be morally capable to take on leadership, which means to fall in love, like Helga LaRouche said, to fall in love with the potential that humanity has right now. In getting rid of the empire, in mobilizing the BRICS process to make it bigger than even what it is now. So with that, I would like to suggest to everybody to turn off their cell phones or put it on silent, and no drinks, no food allowed because of the conditions of the premises. And
Oh, yeah, ben, s'il y a du monde qui a besoin d'une traduction, il y a des machines pour traduire en arrière. Vous pouvez demander à Jean-Philippe, so that's necessary.
Question is that Dennis will give a presentation following which we will have a question and answer session where people are encouraged to speak, to throw out questions, comments, discussions, which is very important. So with that, Dennis, please.
Okay. So let me see that. Sure. All right. You want to get your, we'll just start with the prelude. Just go with that. So what we're going to try to do today is give various of you a reason to change your lives. Mainly because they're about to be changed in a dramatic way anyway, in a way that you probably wouldn't like if you were still able to be conscious after your probable demise and were to be able to be resurrected and asked whether or not you approved of what had just occurred to you. That's where we are. It's sort of like being on the verge of, or in, if you will, the world audience of the First World War, where you don't even know that there's about to be a world war, let alone, there's sort of wars going on in Europe somewhere, in a couple of places, around matters that have no consequence whatsoever to you individually. Yet, 4 years later, not only will 20 million of you be dead, but another 50 to 70 million will also die of a disease that you didn't even know existed 6 years earlier. That is the world that you have been graciously led into by a series of failures, disguised as individual human politicians and clergymen and others. Now, on the one hand, that exists. Now, there's something else that also exists, which is there are people who have fought the idea that the human race is necessarily tragic. That there's this notion that you have that often gets taught, used to be taught a lot more, when things used to be taught. Now things are really either asserted, or they're texted, or they're emailed. They aren't any longer taught. But back in the day when people were concerned to miseducate people, there was a notion of a cyclical theory of history. And in the cyclical theory of history, the idea was that every society rises and falls, and it's inevitable that societies have a birth, they have a maturation, and then they have a decline and then a death. And so societies are sort of like species, and certain species come into the ascendancy and then they're superseded by others, and you really can't do anything about that. One of the authors that pushed that in a big way was a guy by the name of Oswald Spengler, and he wrote a book called The Decline of the West, which back 50 years ago, 60 years ago, you used to see on the back of all the Sunday magazines. Back in the old days, before there was Parade magazine and all these other things, where people can't read any longer. They used to have on the back of your Sunday magazine a thing called the Book of the Month Club. What this was these were suggestions being made to you for how to brainwash yourself along the lines of various forms of social policy that were being inculcated into the society. But back then, it was a do-it-yourself sort of thing in the sense that you had to actually do the work. You had to know how to read, and you had to be able to be at least willing to become conversant in a set of opinions that were actually leading to policies that had already been pre-planned. But you were now going to think you were initiating by your having read something and independently come to the conclusion that you disagreed or agreed with that particular set of ideas. So 50 years ago, you would see on the back of the Book of the Month Club selections, Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. And if you happen to be unlucky enough, as I was back in that time, to believe the things that you were told to read, then you got his book, and you read his book. And you became very upset because you were being told that there was no choice. It was simply going to be the case that Western civilization, of which you were in some fashion connected, was definitely just going to like disappear. Just going to happen, and it was going to happen in some dramatically obscene way over which you had no control. There are people in the world that plan these things, or design these things, or think in these terms, and sometimes you can't exactly blame them, because you have to understand that if you think of yourself as a species, as an animal species, then it is true that your history, your culture, your outlook is limited, and it is coming to an end, and it is ignominious, and it is obscene. This is an individual who sometimes confuses some people. His name is Bertrand Russell, lived for about a century, died in the late 60s, and is often referred to as a great intellectual. He's known for writing a very abstruse book of mathematics called Principia Mathematica, with a man by the name of Alfred North Whitehead. But he's also mainly known for over the past half-century as a sort of precursor of the peace movement, and in one sense the environmentalist movement and many other things. What I'm going to do at the beginning of our presentation is I'm going to show you a set of pictures of ghosts. Ghosts that haunt you. See, people like to have parties on Halloween, but they never consider that they truly are haunted. And that their every day, their every waking minute is actually shaped by ghosts. The shadows of forgotten ancestors, good and evil. And if they were to know who those people were, they might actually begin to comprehend why they feel so bad about living at all. A queer feeling of insecurity, of familiar worlds upset. There is an almost instinctive reaction, a reaction to the obvious, visible differences between black and white. He goes on. This is all quotes, okay? You have only to go to a nigger camp meeting to see the African mind in operation. The shrieks, the dancing and yelling and sweating, the surrender to the most violent emotion, the ecstatic blending of the soul of the Congo with the practice of the Salvation Army. Goes on a little bit more. Although the matter is not wholly settled, most biological authorities, such as Davenport, I'll tell you who that is in a minute, believe that which we should a priori expect is actually true. Namely, that Mendelian recombination of the two sets of factors which cooperatively build up the well-adapted Negro and Caucasian types gives rise to all sorts of disharmonious organisms. To translate for you, that means sex between blacks and whites creates mongrels. Okay? Then there is the undoubted fact that by putting some of the white man's minds into the mulatto, you not only make him more capable and more ambitious, there are no well-authenticated cases of pure blacks rising to any eminence, but you increase his discontent and create an obvious injustice if you continue to treat him like any full-blooded African. The American Negro is making trouble because of the American white blood that is in him. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now that's his brother, Aldous Huxley. Now a lot of people like Aldous Huxley, see, because Aldous Huxley liked psychedelics. And he became sort of famous in the 1960s because of his writing in the 1950s of The Doors of Perception. Then he became famous by the 60s. The Doors of Perception is the essay on psychedelics, LSD, that was the inspiration for the famous rock group The Doors. And so people look upon Huxley favorably. I don't. He gave an interview in 1958, and I want to refer to that. gave the interview to an interviewer by the name of Mike Wallace, now deceased, used to be very famous back on CBS. Here's what he said. He said, Aldous Huxley is a man of letters as disturbing as he is distinguished. Born in England, now a resident of California, Mr. Huxley just finished a series of essays called Enemies of Freedom, in which he outlines and defines some of the threats to our freedom in the United States. So Mr. Huxley, right off the bat, let me ask you, who and what are the enemies of freedom here in the United States? So Huxley now responds. He says, I should say that there are two main impersonal forces. First of all, the first of them is not exceedingly important in the United States at the present time, though it is very important in other countries. This is the force which in general can be called overpopulation, the mounting pressure of populations pressing upon existing resources. And then he says, this is an extraordinary thing. Something is happening which has never happened before in the world's history. I mean, let's just take a simple fact that between the time of the birth of Christ and the landing of the Mayflower, 1620, so it's 1620 years, the population of the earth doubled. It rose from 250 million to probably 500 million. Today, it would be 1958, the population of the earth is rising at such a rate that it will double in half a century. And then he says that totalitarianism will be the result of this. So now, what happens is that the interviewer is questioning him and asking him about this. And he says, well, ironically then, one of the greatest forces against communism in the world, the Catholic Church, according to your thesis, Mr. Huxley, would seem to be pushing us directly into the hands of the communists because they are against birth control. In other words, the Catholic Church is against birth control. Huxley is saying because of overpopulation, you're going to have totalitarian governments. Therefore, we must oppose population growth because if we don't, we're going to get communism. So he's talking to an American audience who's got to say something that they're likely to believe. So the interviewer is saying, wait a minute, and that would be to say that the Catholic Church really is supporting communism, which doesn't make sense to me. And so Huxley says, well, I think that this strange paradox probably is true. Now this is important if you look at the present Pope. And if you want to actually understand one of the major forces presently going, one of the major battles going on presently in the world, which is that the Catholic Church, on the part of certain individuals who will now appear on my screen, had been targeted from the period of the late 50s and early 60s as the major opponent force to be neutralized in order to allow for radical population reduction policy